saying congratulations on the film. I had the privilege of being able to sit down and watch it last night, and it is an amazing film, so congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much.
So tell us a little bit about where the idea for the film first came about, because of course you had your 2013 short film as well. Where did the idea first start with you for Night Raiders?
Yeah, it was around that time when I was making the short that you mentioned called Awakening, which was also set in a near dystopian Canadian city. And I had it was my first foray into genre filmmaking, and I just found a lot of freedom in the space. And so when I went to make my feature, I was sort of drawn to this idea of something in the future as a way of talking about the past. So even though everything in the film is imaginary, it's actually all based on everything that's already happened in history.
You mentioned that there was a lot of freedom of space in genre filmmaking. Tell us a little bit about that freedom. How did you find it so free, and what attracted you to that freedom as well?
Yeah, I mean, up until that point, I'd made sort of serious dramas about Indigenous life, and I think all of my work in some ways touches upon the impact of colonization on Indigenous people. But there was something about the genre space where you could lean into things that are fantastical or place things that you want to talk about in a new context that was really freeing, like to not be constrained by realism was really incredible to work in. And then I also started to feel like it invites audiences into what you want to say. And in some ways, you can hit your message harder in a way because you aren't constrained by reality or even the questioning of, whether or not this is accurate, because you can just go for it and do what you want. And I think the fantastical elements as well. I mean, it's just exciting to work with those things as a filmmaker and to imagine, near futures and make all of that stuff up. So yeah, I loved it.
What was that like as a screenwriter, kind of sitting down and creating this world for your characters? Because I know the writer of the Maze Runner franchise said that they ended up creating 100-page document about what the world was like around their characters when it came to politics and things like that. What is that journey like as a screenwriter, sitting down and creating that world or that universe around your characters?
Yeah, it sounds like a similar process. My film is set about just over 30 years into the future, so it's not that far. And so I started with a world timeline starting from that year, which was 2013, and I projected the political outcomes of every I was sort of focused on the US because they have such a huge influence of Canada and the world, so that just what were the political circumstances of every election going 30 years into the future. And I was interested in this. Well, one of the reasons why I started to think about the film in this way was not only everything that happened to Indigenous people, and one of the main policies that I was focused on was the residential school system in Canada, which was a child removal policy that was in place for 7 generations of Indigenous families. But I was also thinking about the future and the fact that in North America, there's going to come a day that's coming very soon where the number of non-white children being born will outnumber the number of white children being born. And I just thought about what those shifting demographics mean and how that might upset the power structures. And so I thought in my own head that there's going to be a white supremacist backlash. And so I started to research, like any far-right movement, like, of course, Hitler and the uprising of the Nazis, but also the Tea Party in the U.S., which was around at the time. But when I started writing the film, Donald Trump wasn't even on the scene yet. And so the far-right backlash in the U.S. actually happened sooner in real life than what was projected in my false imaginary timeline.
No, your central characters as well, they are such amazing characters as an audience. You can't help but find yourself supporting their cause. Tell us a little bit about the screenwriting journey of creating those central characters for your film as well.
Yeah, all of the characters are real, survivors that live in a very difficult world under incredibly oppressive circumstances. But I think all of them are asked to come into themselves or into their power in some way. Oppressive circumstances are not new to the Indigenous experience. And so a lot of the characters were inspired by qualities in many people that I know from my own communities, and also the way that they express a kind of strength and resilience and leadership. And sometimes that doesn't look like, expected sort of heroic, I was trying to also subvert some of those tropes and present kind of heroes in a different way, in a way that like felt authentic to the people that I knew. But yeah, I fell in love with all of the characters as I wrote them. And so after I'd written the world timeline, I went back and wrote a character timeline, which focuses, of course, on Niska, the main character, and then what time in the world timeline was she born and how old was she? Because in this world, there's also a civil war in North America that redraws the map of North America. And so this film takes place in the post-Civil War period, but it sort of like tracks Niska's life as she would have gone through the war and out the other end of it, and then the birth of her daughter. And so all of these characters are placed within the world timeline, and then developed that way as well.
Niska is such an amazing character. How important was that to you to find the right casting when it came to Niska and her daughter, and how did you go about that casting process for finding the right people for such important characters?
Yeah, I mean, Niska had been so alive in my head for so long, and we eventually cast Elamaya Tailfeathers, who's just a stellar actor, and the young woman, Brooklyn Letexier Hart, who played Wasis, she was a total discovery, and we worked with a casting director in the U.S., Renee Haynes, who pretty much looked at everybody for both of those roles, but looked at over 300 girls across North America for Wasis. And we ended up finding her in the Midwest of Canada in a city called Winnipeg, which actually is in the neighboring province to where I'm from. And as soon as she came into the room, she came in for a smaller role, and I just thought, she's it, And so we brought her back for a callback, and she just totally nailed it. And Ella Maya, who plays Niska, was known to me actually as a filmmaker, and I'd known her for years in that capacity. And she had acted in the past, but I'd sort of forgotten about that because she had just released a movie in the year before Night Raiders that is also a beautiful, beautiful movie as a director. And so we just got a tape in from her, through the regular casting process. And I was like, oh my God, Almaya. And so she did this beautiful audition, and then we flew her out to Toronto for the callbacks, and she just like moved me to tears in the final audition. And she brings this incredible quality, like this balance of like total toughness with a kind of softness and vulnerability that is such a beautiful combination.
Definitely. Now, you said before as well that this film has such an important message behind it about the history of Indigenous people in Canada. How important was that for you to get that message across? And because you do it in such a creative way, we've seen a similar thing happen here in Australia over the last few years, where Indigenous filmmakers have really been able to tell their story in the genre filmmaking area of filmmaking. Why do you think that area of filmmaking works so well to tell the story? And what was the message that you were trying to get across to your audience with this film as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the genre space is really exciting, and it's been amazing to watch what Indigenous filmmakers are doing. And our global Indigenous community is really interconnected. And so we're all aware of what's being made in other countries. And we've been looking at Australia for many years as leaders in different waves of Indigenous filmmaking. But the genre space for me just creates a fresh entry point. So, I think when you're constrained by difficult issues, and in this case, the central thing is really, the central topic is around what happened to families during the residential school era, which our country put together a commission called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And when they released their findings, they found that a child going into a residential school had a greater chance of dying than a Canadian soldier did going into World War II. And this was a system that was in place for 7 generations of Indigenous families. And when I started writing this back in 2013, I just felt like this conversation wasn't really happening, and it wasn't happening at a national level, and it was not taught in schools. And so Canadians, not just Indigenous Canadians, but Canadians really didn't have a sense of this history, and I felt like this needed to be contended with, and I felt like all colonized countries have to contend with how their countries were founded, and that we needed to have a real reckoning in order to do some soul searching about how we want to live moving forward. And so to me, the message is all about the impact of what removing children from mothers and fathers and families does. And as a tool of colonization, it's one of the most effective tools because the fracturing of families causes intergenerational trauma. So it actually works very well. And I think it's important to raise awareness for things like this so that we can say collectively, we never want this to happen again, and that we all must work to protect the values that we hold dear moving forward. And, we're in a crazy time in the world where we're starting to see democracies under threat. And I think it's a really important time for us to stay vigilant and to stay active and political.
Definitely. How aware were you of Australian productions like Mystery Road and Clever Man and Red Billabong? Were you aware of those films and TV shows and what they had done here?
Absolutely. Mystery Road, I saw the original features by Ivan Sen that the TV show actually got based on. Sometimes we have problems accessing Australian content, but we had also kept our eyes on Clever Man, and I totally remember seeing the whole buzz around that show and how exciting it was. So absolutely, we're well aware of those shows and the impact, and also, that I think the film and television industry in Australia has been leaders from our perspective because, Screen Australia had an Indigenous film office that was helping Indigenous filmmakers since the 90s. And then the person who was running that, Sally Riley, then moved into television. And even just her as an individual has had such a massive impact, promoting Indigenous filmmakers. Like, I've watched all of the films of like Warwick Thornton and Rachel Perkins, and we're aware of like Darren Dale and him as a prolific producer, and Katrina McKenzie and Ivan Sen, and absolutely. It's been amazing to be a part of this global community and to watch what other Indigenous filmmakers and TV makers get up to.
Definitely. Well, Danis, I know we are running right out of time and you've got other interviews to get to, but I just want to say again, congratulations on such an amazing film. And to finish off, what would you like Australians to take away from this film after they sit down and watch it when it's released tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, Australia has its own history. Australia is also a colonial country, and I think the film, even though it's set in North America, is so relevant to what happened in Australia as well, and I hope that it shines a light on the impact of stolen generations of Indigenous families down in Australia as well.